Emily's heart pounded as Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the tense cabin. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone like steel. "A word. Now." Passengers sat frozen, their eyes darting between the captain and the flight attendant who had just moments ago humiliated an innocent family. Emily stiffened, her authority slipping like sand between her fingers. She turned sharply and disappeared toward the front of the plane, her face burning under the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. For a few long moments, the passengers whispered, the murmurs growing louder. Then she returned, pale, stiff, unsteady. Captain Reynolds followed, his jaw tight. His next words sent shockwaves through the cabin. "You're being removed from this flight." A collective gasp filled the air. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, disbelief quickly turning into satisfaction. Emily's breath hitched. "Captain, No," Reynolds cut her off, voice unwavering. "Enough. Get your things. You're leaving this aircraft now." The moment was electric. Passengers clapped, some in quiet approval, others in outright satisfaction. Emily stood frozen, her face burning red, her fingers trembling as she gathered her things. The same walk of shame she had forced onto Daniel was now hers to endure. As she passed Daniel, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply met her gaze and said in a voice low and steady, "You did this to yourself." She flinched. Then she was gone. Justice had arrived 6 minutes later than it should have. But it had arrived. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of justice being served. The hum of New York's JFK Airport was a chaotic symphony of voices, rolling luggage and overhead announcements echoing across the massive terminals. Travelers rushed past each other, some dragging overstuffed suitcases, others clutching coffee cups, eyes glued to departure boards. Businessmen in tailored suits typed furiously on laptops. Families herded children toward security checkpoints, and exhausted tourists slumped into chairs near their gates, waiting for delayed flights. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, fast food, and jet fuel, mingling with the faint hum of conversation in a dozen different languages. TSA officers waved passengers forward, guiding them through security as the line snaked its way toward metal detectors. Every few minutes, a sharp beep pierced the air, followed by a sigh or an exasperated groan as someone fumbled to remove a belt or a forgotten water bottle. Among the sea of travelers, Daniel Johnson tightened his grip on the handle of his rolling suitcase as he weaved through the crowd, his free hand clutching his son's tiny fingers. Liam, barely 4 years old, bounced excitedly at his side, his sneakers squeaking against the polished tile floors. "Are we on the plane yet?" he asked, for what had to be the 10th time in the last 5 minutes. Daniel exhaled through a chuckle, adjusting the strap of his backpack as he glanced over his shoulder at his wife. Sarah trailed just behind them, balancing her purse, Liam's stuffed animal, and a carry-on bag slung over one shoulder, her face a mix of exhaustion and quiet patience. "Not yet, buddy," Daniel said, maneuvering them toward the security line. "Almost there." Sarah offered a weary smile as she reached out to tousle Liam's curls, her fingers lingering in his soft hair. "He's just excited," she murmured to Daniel. "It's his first real trip after all." Daniel nodded, shifting his weight as he watched the long line ahead. The vacation had been a long time coming, a much-needed break from the daily grind. Between Sarah's demanding job as a school teacher and his never-ending deadlines in marketing, they had barely found time for themselves. This trip to Miami was supposed to be their reset, a chance to unwind on the beach and let Liam experience the joy of travel. As they shuffled forward, Liam tugged at Daniel's hand, his eyes widening at the security conveyor belt. "Do we have to put our bags in the big machine?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "Yeah," Daniel answered, hoisting his suitcase onto the belt as Sarah lifted Liam so he wouldn't wander. The TSA agent barely spared them a glance as she gestured for Sarah to step through the metal detector first. She passed without issue, turning back just in time to see Daniel guiding Liam forward. The machine beeped, and Liam giggled as he ran toward his mother, arms outstretched. Daniel gathered their belongings as quickly as possible, tossing Liam's stuffed dinosaur back into the bag before adjusting the straps over his shoulder. "All right," he said, flashing Sarah a grin. "Gate C12. Let's go before our son asks me if we're on the plane again." Sarah laughed softly, gripping Liam's hand as they moved toward their gate, blending seamlessly into the endless river of passengers all chasing the same destination. Emily Carter moved briskly through the cabin, adjusting overhead compartments and straightening the neatly folded safety instruction pamphlets in the seat pockets. Every detail had to be in order before takeoff. A seasoned flight attendant with 10 years of experience, she prided herself on her efficiency and control. Order was everything at 35,000 feet, and she had no patience for disruption. She had dealt with all kinds of passengers over the years: entitled businessmen who snapped their fingers for attention, nervous flyers who clutched armrests like lifelines, restless children kicking seats, and, of course, those she mentally categorized as problem passengers. The ones who argued about carry-on limits, refused to comply with safety regulations, or claimed mistreatment the moment they didn't get what they wanted. She had little sympathy for any of them. The airline had policies for a reason, and she enforced them without hesitation. Past experiences had hardened her. She had been accused of being rude, too strict, lacking warmth, but she didn't see her job as one that required kindness. Passengers came and went, but her duty remained the same: keep things running smoothly, follow procedure, and ensure everyone got to their destination without incident. Compassion had never been part of the job description. At least, that's what she told herself. As she made her way back to the galley, she caught sight of the last few passengers trickling onto the plane. She scanned them with her usual practiced eye, assessing their behavior before they even reached their seats. Daniel Johnson walked down the aisle, with his son at his side, his wife following closely behind. They moved with the kind of tired efficiency that came with traveling as a family, polite but distracted, maneuvering their luggage carefully to avoid bumping other passengers. As they reached their assigned row, Daniel hoisted a backpack off his shoulder and knelt to slide it under the seat in front of him. Emily's eyes lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, her expression tightening slightly. She had seen too many situations turn into trouble before takeoff. She wasn't looking for problems, but experience had taught her that certain instincts were rarely wrong. Without a word, she turned back toward the front of the plane, but something about the way she glanced over her shoulder suggested that she wasn't quite done watching. The plane hummed with the quiet rustle of passengers settling in, flipping through magazines, adjusting their seatbelts, and scrolling through their phones as they waited for the final announcements. The low murmur of conversation blended with the occasional clink of overhead compartments being shut. Emily stood near the front of the cabin, her arms folded tightly across her chest as she scanned the rows. Everything seemed in order. No loud disruptions, no passengers refusing to comply with regulations, no last-minute emergencies, just the way she liked it. Then she heard a voice from first class, sharp and frustrated. "Excuse me, has anyone seen my wallet?" The man's voice carried easily through the cabin, cutting through the general noise. Mike Simmons, a well-dressed businessman in his early 40s, sat stiffly in his plush first-class seat, his hands patting down the pockets of his blazer with increasing urgency. His face darkened with frustration as he checked his briefcase, flipping through folders, rifling through compartments. "I swear I had it when I boarded." Emily's attention snapped to him immediately. She stepped forward, her professional tone taking on an edge of authority. "Sir, when did you last see it?" Simmons barely glanced at her as he continued his frantic search. "I had it at the gate. I took out my boarding pass, put it back in my pocket, then I got on the plane. Now it's gone." His voice was growing tighter, his frustration bleeding into something sharper. Emily's pulse quickened. A missing wallet before takeoff meant one thing: possible theft. Her mind went into immediate protocol mode. She had seen things like this before, passengers getting too comfortable, thinking no one would notice a quick sleight of hand. It always happened fast. A moment of distraction, a sleight of movement, and just like that, valuables vanished. "Are you sure you didn't misplace it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already ruled out that possibility. Simmons' jaw tightened. "I've checked everywhere. It was in my jacket pocket, now it's not." Emily turned, scanning the rows behind him, her gaze moving swiftly over the passengers in business class and then down to economy. The usual suspects in these situations were the ones closest to the scene. It had to have happened between the time he boarded and now. And then, her eyes landed on the Johnson family. Daniel was adjusting his son's seatbelt, his posture relaxed, completely unaware of the way Emily was now watching him. The black backpack he had slid under his seat earlier was still there, tucked neatly at his feet. Emily's jaw tightened slightly. She had seen him handling his bag during boarding, shifting it, moving things around. And now, with a missing wallet in play, it didn't take much to connect the dots. Her gut told her she was right. She straightened her posture, clearing her throat before stepping forward. "I think I may have an idea where it is," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. She started walking down the aisle, her sharp gaze locked onto Daniel's row. Emily stopped abruptly at Daniel's row, her shadow falling over the family as she squared her shoulders, her posture rigid with authority. The hum of conversation around them quieted slightly, passengers sensing an unusual tension in the air. Daniel, who had just finished adjusting Liam's seatbelt, looked up, surprised to find the flight attendant looming over him. Sarah, seated beside him, immediately tensed, her grip on their son tightening instinctively. "Sir," Emily said, her voice controlled but loud enough for several rows to hear, "I need to ask you a question." Daniel frowned, his expression shifting from confusion to wary attentiveness. "Sure, what's going on?" "A wallet has been reported missing," Emily stated, her tone clipped and professional, but with an unmistakable edge. "I noticed you handling your bag earlier. Did you pick up something that doesn't belong to you during boarding?" For a moment there was silence. Sarah inhaled sharply beside him, her body going rigid. Liam, still oblivious to the weight of what was happening, wiggled slightly in his seat, distracted by the colorful buttons on his armrest. Daniel blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable tension in it, like a wire pulled too tight. Emily's gaze didn't waver. "A first-class passenger's wallet has gone missing. You were adjusting your bag when you boarded. I just need to verify that you don't have it." The murmuring among nearby passengers grew louder, heads turning as people, subtly or not so subtly, watched the scene unfold. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved, while others leaned in slightly, their curiosity piqued. Sarah's fingers dug into Liam's small shoulder, her voice low but trembling. "You think we stole something?" Emily didn't flinch. "I didn't say that, but I need to confirm." Daniel sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. "You are saying it. You're accusing me in front of all these people." "I just need to check," Emily insisted, still holding her professional mask, but her stance was unyielding. "If you didn't take anything, then there's nothing to worry about." Liam, sensing his mother's distress, looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. "Mommy," he murmured, reaching for her. Sarah quickly pulled him into her lap, pressing a kiss to his head, but her hands trembled against his back. Daniel exhaled slowly, his nostrils flaring. "I don't have a wallet. I didn't take a wallet. I only touched my own bag because I was getting my kid's toy out. That's it." Emily didn't move. "Then you won't mind if I take a look inside your bag?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the rows of passengers. Someone cleared their throat. A man a few seats back muttered, "This is getting ridiculous," but no one openly intervened. Daniel's fingers curled into fists resting on his thighs. "Are you serious right now?" Sarah, still holding Liam tightly, turned to Emily, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "This is humiliating." Emily's face remained impassive. "If you have nothing to hide, there's no reason to refuse." Daniel let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Wow, just like that, huh? No proof, no witnesses, just your assumption." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I'm asking you to cooperate." Daniel's patience snapped. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still measured but dangerously sharp. "Or what? You'll have me dragged off the plane in front of my son? Arrested because you decided I looked like someone who would steal?" Sarah swallowed hard, gripping Liam even tighter as her eyes darted around the cabin. Some passengers were now openly staring while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman across the aisle, a middle-aged mother traveling with her two teenage sons, shot Sarah a look of quiet sympathy. Emily hesitated, but only for a moment. "If you won't allow me to check the bag, I'll have to escalate this to the captain before we take off." Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose. His anger was controlled, but barely. He could feel the weight of a dozen eyes on him, the judgment, the quiet, lingering question that hung in the air. Did he do it? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Just let her look, please." Daniel glanced at her, the raw pain in her expression slicing through his frustration. His shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from his posture. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached down, pulled his backpack from under the seat, and set it on his lap. "Go ahead." Emily didn't hesitate. She unzipped the bag with a deliberate slowness, her movements tense and calculated, as if expecting the wallet to materialize from thin air. Passengers held their breath. The murmurs died down, replaced by an oppressive silence. She pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones, a paperback novel, a snack wrapper, a small toy dinosaur, a phone charger. Nothing else. Emily's fingers twitched slightly as she rifled through the remaining compartments, her expression tightening. She checked again and again, but there was no wallet. Daniel exhaled sharply, his voice laced with anger. "I told you." Sarah let out a shaky breath, pressing her lips to Liam's forehead. He had buried his face in her shoulder, sensing the distress in the air. A man a few rows back scoffed loudly. "Jesus, this is embarrassing." A woman across the aisle shook her head. She just went through that poor man's stuff in front of everyone. For what? Emily zipped the bag shut, stepping back as if the air around her had grown heavier. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, but she forced herself to stand tall. Daniel met her gaze, his voice cold. "Now what?" Emily straightened her shoulders. "I need to check with other passengers." He let out a humorless laugh. "You mean, now that you've proven I didn't take anything, you're moving on?" Emily didn't answer. She turned sharply on her heel, marching back toward the front of the plane, leaving the family in tense silence, surrounded by strangers who had just watched them endure one of the most humiliating moments of their lives. Sarah turned to Daniel, her voice barely audible. "Why us?" Daniel exhaled through his nose, his fingers still clenched on the straps of his backpack. "You know why?" Daniel's pulse pounded as he watched Emily step away without an apology, without so much as an acknowledgement of the humiliation she had just put him through. His hands curled into fists on his lap, his jaw tight enough to crack. Sarah kept her arms wrapped protectively around Liam, who had stopped crying but was now hiccuping quietly against her shoulder. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them like a lead blanket. The stolen glances from other passengers, the unspoken judgment from some, the quiet support from others. It all hung in the air like static electricity before a storm. Emily wasn't done. She stopped at the front of the cabin, speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. The younger woman glanced toward Daniel's row, then back at Emily, her brow furrowing. Whatever Emily was saying, she wasn't getting the response she wanted. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her arms folding tightly across her chest. Daniel's gut twisted. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had made up their mind and refused to back down, even in the face of evidence proving them wrong. A new voice interrupted the growing tension. "Miss." An older woman a few rows back, a white-haired passenger who had been quietly watching everything unfold, shifted in her seat. Her expression was sharp, unimpressed. "Before you go around accusing more people, maybe check your own work area. I saw a wallet near the galley earlier." Emily froze. The passengers stirred again, murmuring amongst themselves. A man behind Daniel let out an irritated scoff. "Wait, you mean this whole time it was up there?" Daniel turned his gaze to Emily, his patience now razor-thin. "Go check," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Now." Emily hesitated, her face unreadable, then turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane. The flight attendant she had spoken to earlier followed, her expression uneasy. Sarah exhaled shakily, shifting Liam in her arms. "Please tell me this isn't happening." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle, rubbing a hand over his face. Oh, it's happening. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Every second dragged on as passengers leaned into the aisle, watching the front of the plane like a stage waiting for the next act to unfold. Then Emily returned. In her hand was a black leather wallet. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Emily's face was pale, her grip tight on the wallet as if she could somehow will it out of existence. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at Sarah. Instead, she addressed the passengers in a clipped tone. "It was found near the galley." A moment of silence. Then, Daniel let out a slow, controlled breath through his nose and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "A misunderstanding," he said, his voice low but filled with barely restrained fury. "That's what you're calling this?" Emily straightened her shoulders, her face blank, refusing to acknowledge her mistake. The businessman from first class, Mike Simmons, let out an exasperated sigh and stood, reaching for his wallet. "Well, that's great," he said sarcastically. "Glad we wasted all that time embarrassing an innocent man before bothering to look in the obvious place." Emily's lips parted slightly as if she were about to say something, but for once, she had nothing to defend herself with. Passengers shook their heads, some muttering, others outright disgusted. The older woman who had spoken up earlier crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "You owe that family an apology." Emily flinched, her fingers tightening around the wallet before she reluctantly extended it to Simmons. "It was an unfortunate mistake," she said stiffly. Daniel let out a breath of disbelief, shaking his head. "That's it?" He gestured around the plane. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. My son..." He gestured to Liam, still curled against Sarah, his little fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt. "My wife, you put us through hell, and that's all you've got?" A low murmur of agreement swept through the cabin. A man a few seats back muttered, "She should be the one leaving this plane, not them." Emily's face went rigid. She was still trying to hold on to the last shreds of control, but the weight of the moment was crushing her. For the first time, her authority had been publicly dismantled, and she had no way to rebuild it. Then, another voice entered the conversation. It was the captain. Emily turned sharply as Captain Mark Reynolds appeared at the front of the plane, his presence immediately commanding attention. His gaze swept over the cabin, quickly assessing the situation before landing on Emily. His jaw tightened. "Miss Carter, a word, now." Emily hesitated, glancing at Daniel one last time before quickly following the captain toward the galley. A tense silence settled over the cabin. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders finally relaxing as he turned to Sarah, who looked just as emotionally exhausted. "You okay?" he murmured. She nodded, but her eyes remained glassy. "He was scared," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of Liam's head. "He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something was wrong." Daniel clenched his jaw. "We're not letting this go." Sarah looked at him, something hard and unyielding in her expression. "No, we're not." A few rows up, the elderly woman gave them a small nod of quiet support. Daniel inhaled deeply, adjusting his grip on his bag. "Let's see what happens next." Emily's hands moved faster now, her fingers rifling through Daniel's bag with a growing sense of urgency. The rustle of fabric and the faint jingle of zippers filled the silence. A pair of noise-canceling headphones, a paperback novel, a snack wrapper, a small toy dinosaur, a phone charger. Nothing else. No wallet. Passengers leaned in, their interest shifting from detached curiosity to something sharper. The tension in the cabin was thick, suffocating. A few rows back, someone let out a slow, unimpressed sigh. A businessman in a crisp suit muttered, "Unbelievable," just loud enough for others to hear. A young woman across the aisle shook her head, her fingers drumming impatiently against her armrest. Daniel's breathing was steady, but the fury in his eyes burned hotter with every second that passed. He sat motionless as Emily zipped the bag closed, her movements stiff, deliberate. Sarah's arm stayed locked protectively around Liam, who was now silent, watching everything with wide, confused eyes. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice dangerously calm. Find what you were looking for?" Emily straightened, gripping the bag as if she wasn't entirely convinced she hadn't somehow missed it. The brief flicker of doubt in her eyes was there, but she masked it quickly, her posture stiffening as she set the bag back down at Daniel's feet. "Looks like it's not here," she said, her tone clipped. Daniel's brows shot up. "Looks like..." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "That's all you've got?" Emily didn't flinch. "I'll have to check with other passengers." Daniel's expression darkened. "No. You don't just get to move on like this. You accused me. You made my wife cry. You made my son cry. And now, because you didn't find what you were so sure was there, you just walk away like it never happened?" A few passengers murmured in agreement. A woman a few rows up shook her head. She just went through his personal stuff in front of everyone. The least she could do is apologize. Emily's jaw tightened. She turned slightly, as if debating whether to engage, but something in her stiff posture made it clear. She wasn't going to back down. "It was a misunderstanding," she said flatly. Daniel's patience snapped. He leaned forward, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "A misunderstanding is bumping into someone in the aisle. What you just did? That was something else." Emily opened her mouth, but before she could speak, another voice interrupted. "You owe them an apology," the elderly woman from earlier called out, her tone firm, unyielding. Emily's fingers twitched at her sides, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked back up the aisle. Passengers watched her retreat, some shaking their heads, others whispering to one another. Daniel let out a slow breath, but his fists remained clenched. Sarah looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't over." Daniel nodded. "Not even close." Sarah could feel the tension in her shoulders, in her chest, in the way her breath came uneven and shallow. Her arms stayed wrapped around Liam, but her hands were shaking. She hated that they were shaking. She had always been good at staying composed, especially in front of their son, but this moment, this humiliation, this suffocating pressure, was different. She could still feel the weight of Emily's eyes on them, even though the flight attendant had walked away. She could still hear the murmurs of the passengers, some quietly sympathetic, others avoiding eye contact, as if ignoring the situation would erase it. Liam shifted in her lap, his small hands gripping her shirt, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric. His body was warm against hers, but it wasn't the usual kind of warmth, the kind that made her feel safe, the kind that reminded her why she endured so much for him. This was different. He wasn't just resting against her, he was clinging. "Mommy," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the cabin. Sarah kissed the top of his head, squeezing her eyes shut for a second, willing herself to calm down. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "Everything's okay." It was a lie, and she knew it. Liam pulled back slightly, looking up at her with wide, worried eyes. "Are you mad?" The question hit her harder than she expected. "No, sweetheart," she said quickly, shaking her head, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not mad." Liam turned toward Daniel, his little brows furrowing. Daniel was sitting so still that it scared her. His fists were resting on his thighs, clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on a fixed point ahead, as if he were trying to keep himself from doing something, saying something that would make everything worse. "Daddy?" Liam tried again, shifting in Sarah's arms. Daniel's head finally turned, his expression softening just enough for Liam to see that he wasn't ignoring him. He reached out, resting a gentle hand on Liam's knee. "I'm not mad at you, buddy," he said, voice steady but low. Liam blinked, but Sarah saw the shift. He wasn't convinced. Because Liam was smart, maybe too smart for his own good sometimes. He didn't understand everything that had just happened, but he understood enough. He understood that something bad had happened to his parents. He understood that his mother was holding him too tightly, that his father's voice wasn't the same as it had been before. And then it happened. A hiccup, a sniffle, a sudden intake of breath that caught in his throat. And then the sobs. Liam buried his face in Sarah's chest, his small shoulders shaking as he let out loud, uneven cries that filled the cabin with a sharp, unmistakable sound of distress. It wasn't just crying. It was the kind of crying that made strangers turn their heads, that made parents flinch with familiarity, that made people feel something even if they didn't want to. Sarah rocked him instinctively, her hands moving over his back, whispering soft reassurances against his curls. "Shh, it's okay, baby, it's okay, I promise." But it wasn't okay. He knew it wasn't okay. The sound sliced through the heavy silence, making the already uncomfortable situation unbearable. Passengers shifted in their seats. A few looked away, trying to pretend they weren't hearing it. Others exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from sympathy to quiet guilt. A man a few rows back sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jesus, this is a disaster." The elderly woman from earlier turned, her sharp gaze cutting through the air. "This is what happens when you humiliate a family in front of an entire plane."
A woman across the aisle, a mother traveling with two teenagers, glanced at Sarah, her face soft with understanding. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pack of tissues, extending them across the aisle. Sarah hesitated, then took them with a tight, grateful nod. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. His anger hadn't faded, it had just shifted, settled deeper inside him, solidified into something colder. Sarah pressed a tissue to Liam's cheek, wiping away the hot tears that kept spilling. "Baby, please, shh, I've got you, I promise." Liam hiccuped again, his sobs turning into soft, shaky breaths, but his body stayed curled against her, his little hands gripping her shirt as if letting go would mean everything would fall apart. Emily had tried to humiliate them, but all she had done was expose something far worse. The cabin had fallen into a heavy, uncomfortable quiet, broken only by the sound of Liam's muffled sniffles against Sarah's shoulder. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing toward the family with a mix of sympathy and unease. Some exchanged knowing looks, while others seemed eager to return to their phones and books, desperate to detach from the palpable tension in the air. The silence was thick, like the stagnant air of a room no one dared to breathe in. Near the front, a young woman with earbuds removed one, her eyes flicking between the family and the aisle where Emily had disappeared, her expression soft with concern. She leaned over to whisper to her travel companion, who nodded solemnly, casting a quick glance back at the family before looking away. Across the aisle, an older woman, a mother herself, judging by the practiced way she handed her teenage son a pack of gum without looking, gave Sarah a gentle nod of encouragement. She recognized the helplessness in Sarah's eyes, the way she cradled her son protectively, a mother's instinct to shield her child from the cruelty of the world, even in a space where they were meant to be safe. But not everyone shared that sentiment. Toward the back of the plane, a man in a rumpled suit let out a sigh, loud enough to be heard several rows up. He leaned over to his seatmate, grumbling under his breath, "Here we go again. Always a problem." His voice carried just enough disdain to cut through the uneasy silence, and Sarah's back stiffened. She pressed her lips together, refusing to turn around, but Daniel's eyes flicked in that direction, his gaze darkening. The man caught his eye for a brief second, then looked away, clearly uninterested in any confrontation. Nearby, a woman tutted softly, her disapproval evident, but it was hard to tell if her judgment was aimed at the situation or the family. Further up, a teenager raised her phone slightly, pretending to adjust her screen while capturing a quick video of the tense scene. Her friend nudged her, whispering, "Don't. It's not right." The girl hesitated, cheeks flushing with embarrassment, before lowering her phone, but the damage had been done. A few rows over, a young man shook his head, his jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They didn't do anything. You can't just accuse someone like that." His words seemed to break the fragile silence, and a ripple of conversation spread through the cabin. People murmured to their seatmates, their voices hushed but tense, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket cleared his throat, his eyes narrowed in quiet disapproval as he watched the front of the plane, waiting for some sort of resolution that never came. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, her expression tight with discomfort, but she didn't stop. She didn't look at the family. She just focused on the task at hand, avoiding the growing unease that settled over the passengers like a heavy fog. The woman who had offered Sarah tissues shifted in her seat, her eyes filled with quiet outrage. She leaned slightly toward her husband, whispering in a tone meant to be overheard. "You'd think they'd be more careful before making accusations like that. It's not just embarrassing, it's wrong." Her husband nodded, his expression grim. "It's hard enough traveling with a young kid. They didn't need this." The empathetic comments reached Sarah's ears, but they barely registered past the buzzing static of her own anxiety. She stroked Liam's hair, murmuring soothing words she didn't quite believe, her focus entirely on keeping him calm. Meanwhile, Daniel's tension was a live wire beneath his skin. He sat rigid in his seat, his fists clenched on his thighs, eyes darting around the cabin as if taking stock of every reaction, every expression, every judgment cast in their direction. He could feel the weight of eyes on them, some sympathetic, some dismissive, some outright hostile. A couple in the row ahead whispered to each other, their voices too low to catch, but their furtive glances spoke volumes. Daniel's frustration simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. It was the silent accusations that stung the most, the unspoken assumptions, the quiet questions that hung in the air. Had they done something wrong? Was there more to the story? Why else would the flight attendant target them so confidently? It was the same undercurrent of suspicion they'd faced countless times before in small, subtle ways, at the grocery store, at the park, even at parent-teacher conferences. But never like this, never so blatant, so public, so humiliating. A young man with a backpack shifted uncomfortably, shooting the family a glance before leaning back in his seat with a sigh. "You'd think people would learn," he muttered quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "Can't just assume the worst about someone." The sentiment hung in the air, resonating with the handful of passengers brave enough to acknowledge the injustice they'd just witnessed. But others remained indifferent, staring blankly at their screens or pretending to be absorbed in the in-flight magazine, unwilling to engage in the messy reality unfolding before them. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, the suffocating pressure of being seen and judged and reduced to a caricature of guilt, a suspicion that lingered even after the truth had been laid bare. She squeezed Liam tighter, his small body trembling against hers, and wished for nothing more than to disappear into the background, to be invisible in a world that had always scrutinized them too closely. Daniel sat completely still, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs, his breath slow and measured. He had learned, over time, how to control his anger, how to let it simmer beneath the surface, to swallow the sharp retorts, to force himself to breathe through the tightness in his chest. But this was different. This was not a delayed order at a restaurant. This was not a shop clerk watching him a little too closely. This was not a coworker making an offhanded comment they thought was harmless. This was his family. This was his wife holding their son like she could somehow protect him from what had just happened. This was his child, his innocent boy, sobbing in his mother's arms because a stranger had decided to make them a spectacle. Daniel had spent his entire life knowing the world didn't always see him as innocent. He had spent years biting his tongue, avoiding confrontation, letting things go because that was easier, safer. But not today. Not after this. He inhaled deeply, the cabin air suddenly too thick, too stifling, as he finally, "Sir." The moment he rose from his seat, the entire section of the plane seemed to tense. Sarah's eyes snapped to him, her grip on Liam tightening instinctively. "Daniel!" But he wasn't looking at her, he was looking straight at Emily. "You accused me," he said, his voice low, steady, and dangerously controlled. Emily, who had returned to the front of the plane after the search, turned at the sound of his voice. Her face was still set in stubborn resolve, her posture stiff. She had not yet fully grasped what was happening, that she had lost control of the situation, that her authority, her entitlement, was slipping through her fingers. Daniel took a slow step into the aisle. "You accused me," he repeated, his voice carrying through the tense, silent cabin, "in front of my child." Emily flinched. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Daniel saw it. Passengers shifted in their seats, Some looked away, uncomfortable with the rawness of his words, the naked humiliation they had all witnessed. Others leaned forward, watching with silent approval. Emily cleared her throat. "Sir, I understand you're upset." "You don't," Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp but never raised. "Because if you did, you would have apologized." Emily straightened her spine, grasping at the last remnants of her control. "I was just doing my job. Mistakes happen." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Mistakes happen." He let the words settle between them, repeating them slowly, as if testing them, tasting them, finding them completely unacceptable. A voice from behind him scoffed, low but unmistakable. "That's not a mistake. That was a choice." Murmurs rippled through the passengers again. Emily's face tightened. "I was only trying to resolve the situation as quickly as possible." Daniel stepped closer. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't pointing fingers or making a scene, but his presence, his control, was commanding enough that Emily took half a step back, without meaning to. "Quickly," he said, his voice still quiet but razor sharp. Quickly would have been checking the galley first. Quickly would have been not assuming that the black man in the aisle seat was a thief. A gasp somewhere in the back. Emily's face flushed. That is not what happened. It's exactly what happened. For the first time, Emily had no response. Sarah stood now too, still holding Liam close, her expression unreadable. But Daniel could feel the anger beneath her silence, the weight of every moment like this they had endured before. A few rows away, a woman nodded in quiet agreement. Another passenger murmured, "He's right." A deep, authoritative voice broke through the tension. "Mrs. Johnson." Daniel turned just as Captain Mark Reynolds stepped out from the cockpit, his presence instantly shifting the power dynamic. Unlike Emily, the captain did not look uncertain or defensive. His gaze was measured, calm, but there was something else in it. Understanding. Daniel forced himself to take a breath, stepping back just slightly. The captain's eyes flicked toward Emily, then back to Daniel. "I'd like to speak with you both now." Emily swallowed hard but nodded stiffly. Sarah let out a breath, pressing a kiss to Liam's forehead, whispering something only he could hear. Daniel met her gaze. This wasn't over. Not even close. Sarah hadn't spoken. Not really. Not since the moment Emily had accused them. Not since Daniel had been forced to sit there and take it while a stranger dug through his belongings in front of an entire plane. She had held Liam, rocked him, tried to keep him from absorbing too much of what was happening. But he wasn't stupid. He had felt it. The shame, the humiliation, the anger simmering beneath his parents' skin, even as they tried to protect him from it. Now, as the captain's words hung in the air and Daniel took a step back, she felt it boil over. She didn't remember making the decision to stand, but suddenly she was on her feet, Liam still pressed against her hip, his face buried in her shoulder. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her breath shaking, but when she spoke, her voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "You saw a black man and you assumed." Emily flinched, her face tightening as she took a step back. But Sarah didn't let her escape. "You didn't ask anyone else," Sarah continued, voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. "You didn't question the passengers sitting in first class. You didn't search anyone else's bag, just his." A murmur swept through the plane, shifting like a wave. A few passengers looked away, suddenly deeply interested in their tray tables. Others exchanged guilty glances as if they had realized something ugly about themselves, about the assumptions they'd made when Emily first accused Daniel. A man near the back cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Maybe it wasn't about that," he muttered, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. Sarah's head snapped toward him, eyes burning. "Really?" she said, her voice like ice. "Because we've been dealing with people like her our entire lives." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Liam stirred against her, but Sarah barely felt him now. She turned back to Emily, whose face was flushed with something between shame and anger. The flight attendant still stood stiffly, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched as if she were desperate to hold onto any last shred of authority. Sarah took a step forward, forcing her to look at her. You never thought, not for 1 second, that you could be wrong. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. Because people like you never do. A sharp inhale from somewhere nearby. A woman pressed a hand over her mouth, her expression stricken. Mima's throat bobbed. That's not... Don't, Sarah snapped. Don't tell me that's not what this is. Don't stand here and lie to me, to him. She gestured at Daniel, who was still rigid with fury, his fingers twitching at his sides, and to everyone on this plane who just watched what you did. Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. Passengers shifted again. Some looked at Emily differently now, not as a professional handling a situation, but as a woman who had been so certain of her own righteousness that she had humiliated an innocent family without hesitation. A woman across the aisle finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. She's right. A murmur of agreement followed. A man near the front shook his head, muttering, "Damn shame." The older woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had actually helped solve the problem, sighed heavily. Some people just can't admit when they're wrong. Emily's posture stiffened. For a moment, Sarah thought she might double down, might try to justify herself again, but then Emily did something unexpected. She looked around. Really, look. And for the first time, she seemed to realize what had just happened. Not just that she had been wrong, not just that she had embarrassed herself, but that she had been seen by every single person in that cabin, by the people who had initially trusted her judgment, by the ones who had looked at Daniel and thought, even for a second, that maybe Emily had been right.